Hello AP Biology students, this is Mr. Laudermith. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to you as the case may be. This is part 1 of a screencast on cells and cell organelles. Doing life's work. So let's start with the basics of cell theory. This was formulated in the late 1800s into the early 1900s, and it says basically three things. All organisms, all life as we know it, is made of cells. The cell is the basic unit of structure and function. In other words, any job a living organism has to do, we can reduce that job down to something happening at a cellular level. And finally, cells only come from pre-existing cells. In our part 2 of evolution unit, we talked a little bit about how the first cells might have arisen on Earth, but today we only understand life as arising from pre-existing cells. Cells divide, creating new cells. Cells can differentiate, they can change to do different jobs, but they must have had a parent cell. So here's just a couple examples of the variety we'll find on Earth. There are animal cells like blood cells. There are fungal cells like these single-celled yeast. And there are algal cells like these plankton, which are capable of doing photosynthesis. Cells do have a range of sizes. You might think, well, cells, they're all small. Yeah, that's true, but there is still a range here from about 1 micrometer to 100 micrometers. There are actually limits, though, on just how small or how big a cell could actually be. Cells smaller than about 1 micrometer simply could not contain enough DNA, enzymes, or nutrients to actually work properly as a cell. There is a minimum amount of space you need just to be able to fit in all the stuff that a living cell needs to operate. So it can't get much smaller than about a micrometer across. There is a maximum size limit as well. That, though, is determined by the relationship between surface area and volume. This is something we'll study in an upcoming lab. Let's assume for the moment that all cells are cubes. Yeah, I know a lot of cells are round, but the cube is just going to make the math a bit easier. If we want to find the surface area of a cube, our formula is 6 times the side length squared, 6s squared. If we want to find the volume, that formula is side length cubed, v equals s cubed. So let's say that we have a cubic cell that measures 1 on a side, and a larger cubic cell that measures 3 on a side. Well, the surface area for the smaller cube ends up being 6, and its volume is 1. For the larger cube, its surface area is 54, and its volume is 27. If we find the surface area to volume ratio, if we take SA and divide it by V, that ends up being 6 for the little cell and 2 for the big cell. So notice something. As cells get bigger, the surface area to volume ratio gets smaller. Eventually that ratio would get so small, materials could not move in and out of the cell fast enough to reach everywhere in the cell in a timely manner. In other words, as cells get bigger, you have less surface area trying to do the jobs needed to service a bigger volume, can't get things in and out fast enough. So that does set an upper limit on cell size. You have to have a big enough surface area to volume ratio, and as cells get bigger, that ratio gets smaller, it shrinks. So what kind of cells are we going to look at? Well, there are prokaryotic cells. Unfortunately, we don't have microscopes powerful enough to see them. These would include, of course, bacteria. They don't have separate membrane-bound organelles. They're the simplest type of cell on Earth, but they are very diverse and successful. We're mostly going to focus on eukaryotic cells. These include plant and animal cells that do have organelles that do specific jobs and are surrounded by membranes, creating separate compartments within the cytoplasm of the cell. So we will examine functions of both animal and plant cells. Let's take a minute, though, and talk about important features of prokaryotic cells. They are less complex, but they are very successful on Earth. There are far more bacteria than there is any other type of life. They have a cell wall, though it is built of different material than plants. The cell wall of a bacteria is peptidoglycan, not cellulose, but it still serves to protect the cell and help maintain its shape. Beneath, interior to the cell wall, we'll find a membrane called a plasma membrane, and it is a phospholipid bilayer. It's built from those phospholipids with the hydrophilic heads pointing out and the hydrophobic tails pointing toward the inside of the bilayer. There is cytoplasm. Mostly it is liquid, mostly water. We call that sometimes the cytosol. It's got water, it's got enzymes, it's got ribosomes. There's a region where the bacteria's DNA likes to hang out, but it's not surrounded by a membrane. We just call that region the nucleoid. As well, we'll find that there is DNA, generally in the form of a big loop of DNA, a single chromosome, or sometimes in the form of smaller loops called plasmids. So those are the major features of prokaryotic cells. Got a little diagram here just kind of summarizing some of the things I just mentioned. You've got the ribosomes, you've got cytoplasm, you've got a nucleoid region where the DNA hangs out. There is a cellular membrane or plasma membrane surrounded by a cell wall. Some bacteria, their very outer layer is a slimy coat called the capsule. It helps them adhere to the surfaces where they grow. Some bacteria also have flagella, long whip-like extensions from the cell wall that help them swim around, but not all bacteria have those. Why are we taking the time to study these cells at all? Well, because they are the building blocks for larger organisms. Cells become tissues. Tissues are assembled into organs. Organs form bodies. We are made up of cells, trillions and trillions of them. It's only when we assemble those cells together that we can create a complex organism. Cells do all the work of life. As I mentioned earlier, no matter what job we think of a body as doing, respiring, exchanging gases, digesting food, generating energy, that can all be reduced down to something happening within particular groups of cells. So if we talk about the jobs an organism has to do to survive, they have to exchange gases. They have to take in oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide. They have to eat and break down that food to extract the energy. They have to generate energy from the food they take in. And of course, they have to build more complex molecules like the macromolecules, the polymers we just learned about in biochemistry, the proteins, the carbs, the lipids, and the nucleic acids. Cells also have to remove waste products. They have to regulate internal conditions. We call this homeostasis. We'll spend a lot more time talking about this next semester. They have to respond to their external environments. They have to be able to adapt to changing conditions. And of course, cells have to build more cells. They have to reproduce themselves for growth, for repair, but also for general reproduction and development purposes. We can take all those jobs and kind of group them under three big headings, three main jobs that cells have to do. They have to produce ATP energy for all of its activities. You need energy to clean up waste. You need energy to make proteins. That's the second big job. Proteins, as we learned in biochemistry, do a wide variety of functions in living organisms. They do most of the types of work a cell has to do. We need lots of different proteins. And finally, cells have to make more cells for growth, but also to replace diseased or damaged cells. We're going to focus on these three main headings and place the parts of a eukaryotic cell, the organelles, into these different groupings based on how they contribute to that job. So, organelles, a word that just means little organ, are the specialized parts of a eukaryotic cell that do a job related to one of those bigger tasks that we just mentioned. They are there to keep the cell alive, which in turn means that you stay alive. They're like mini organs. So let's start with that first job. Cells need energy. In order to fuel daily life and to grow and develop, You have to take in food and digest it. It's only when we break the polymers, the macromolecules in food down, that we can extract the energy from those chemical bonds. That also requires us using oxygen. Combining food with oxygen, you can create ATP energy. This will also generate waste products that have to be removed from the body. There are organelles related to all of those tasks, particularly the cell membrane, the lysosome, vacuoles and vesicles, and of course the powerhouse of the cell itself, the mitochondria. Let's start with the membrane. In basic terms, a membrane separates the outside of the cell from the inside. The jobs going on inside are separate from the environment outside. That means the cell membrane is selectively permeable. It's controlling what enters or leaves the cell. We'll look at that in more detail in a few days. Things that have to move in and out would include oxygen and carbon dioxide, food and water, nutrients and waste products. There's also a signaling function to the cell membrane. It has to receive information from other cells and respond to it. We'll look in more detail how that process works in a few days. But there is communication between cells. The structure of the cell membrane, it's a double fat layer. It's a phospholipid bilayer in which the phosphate heads point toward the outside and the inside, and the tails are all hanging out in the middle. Because the tails are hydrophobic, they form a nice watertight barrier. Within the membrane, you'll also find various proteins. Some of them are involved in transporting things across the membrane. Other proteins are involved in signaling. They receive signals from other cells, or they can help send signals to other cells. So there's our membrane surrounding our animal cell. And there's a quick summary of some of its jobs. Within the cell membrane, we have the cytoplasm, the jelly-like liquidy material where all the organelles live. To get around in the cytoplasm, or to travel to different organelles or out of the cell membrane, you typically need to surround your molecules with a mini membrane, creating what we call vacuoles and vesicles. They help move materials around. You can think of them like packages moving through the cell. They can also be used for longer term storage, especially for things like water or waste. In this case, a small food particle bumps into the cell membrane. It is surrounded by a portion of the membrane, forming a little membrane-bound sac that we call a vesicle. It can then travel into the cytoplasm, where it might meet up with a larger vacuole filled with digestive enzymes, allowing those nutrients to be broken down and perhaps used later for energy. Animal cells will contain these food storage vacuoles, but some also contain waste storage vacuoles, which can contract, they can shrink to push waste products out of the cell. We often call those contractile vacuoles. Within plant cells, there is always one very big central vacuole meant mainly for the storage of water. Plants have to keep a lot of water on hand because it's a necessary starting material for photosynthesis. Another organelle involved in energy production is the lysosome. The lysosome is what digests the food particles taken in by a cell. They also help to clean up the cell by breaking down, by recycling worn out organelles, parts that are no longer needed. It's a membrane-bound sac, again it's like a little package, filled with enzymes, whose job it is to digest polymers, to break bonds between monomers. So here we have lysosomes that are digesting food, but also, as I said, can be used to digest broken or damaged organelles. We see the lysosome very busy here in development of the human embryo. Notice that at 6 weeks old, this embryo has webbed fingers and toes. They are fused together. But by 15 weeks, we can see now separate digits, separate fingers and toes. Where did all the tissue, where did all the skin go that was in between the digits? Well, It got broken down by lysosomes. The lysosomes actually digested cells that were forming the skin, the tissue between the fingers and the toes, until they became separate. In some individuals, that process becomes interrupted and they are born with fingers and toes that are still fused together, as you can see in these pictures. Finally, we have the powerhouse of the cell, the mitochondria. Its job is to take those food particles, which were broken down by the lysosome and taken in by vesicles through the cell membrane, and use them in combination with oxygen to produce lots and lots of cellular energy in the form of a molecule called ATP. We'll look at the job of the mitochondria, the actual reactions it does, and the structure of ATP in more detail in a future unit. But for right now, it's enough to know that the mitochondria is making all this cellular energy. It actually has two membranes around it, which, if you remember, is evidence of the endosymbiotic theory, that mitochondria were once free-living bacteria that formed a partnership with a larger cell. The mitochondria can combine sugar with oxygen in the process of cell respiration. The chloroplast makes energy and sugar from sunlight. So the chloroplast is the organelle of photosynthesis. Takes in sunlight energy and carbon dioxide and uses it to produce sugar. It also produces some ATP energy, mainly to fuel other reactions of photosynthesis. But the sugars it produces in the plant cell can then be sent to mitochondria, or they can be stored, for instance, in the form of polysaccharides, storing that energy, to be used later. The leaves, the roots, the fruit, all the parts of the cell, especially the cell walls, are built out of the sugars that are being generated through this photosynthesis process in the chloroplasts. Here, we're going to wrap this up today, part 1 of cells and cell organelles, with an important reminder. Both plant and animal cells contain mitochondria. Chloroplasts, however, are found only in plant cells. Some people tend to think that plants do chloroplasts, animals do mitochondria. Mitochondria are in both. Both plants and animals need to take those food particles, those sugars, and turn them into lots of ATP. But only plants possess chloroplasts capable of doing photosynthesis. We'll continue this lecture on cells and cell organelles in part 2 tomorrow. Thank you.